So what do you do when a legend is just a legend? Let's talk about it. Welcome back to the least professional channel on YouTube. How's everybody doing tonight? For the last week or so, I have been really sick, and so you might notice my voice is a little bit off tonight. It's not as, weird as it usually is. Maybe it's a little more weird. But I do have tea. So basically, I had no voice Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of this week. I felt like crap most of last weekend. Just a miserable week overall. But the one thing that has allowed me to do was a little bit of research. So I've been wanting to work a little bit more on the How Legends and Tales stuff and try to get something out in the next few weeks. Just because, it's been a while since I've done one of those videos, and it's one of my favorite series, and it's a much anticipated series, one that I really love to do. And so I decided to start digging into some legends this week. I've already got some on the back burner of things that I'm working on, but I wanted to see, maybe I could find something new. I wasn't feeling well anyway, so I'm laying around, got YouTube up, and I'm doing some research. So I found something that I decided I wanted to make a video about, to talk just a little bit about and show you guys maybe the process that I go about, some of the things that I do when it comes to researching these videos, just because I thought that might be kind of interesting to share this with you, because this isn't really going to be an Ohio Legends and Tales topic, just because I'll show you as we go along. Alright, so I went to Google and I searched up Ohio, best ghost stories in Ohio's most true ghost stories, that kind of stuff. And I found this website here. It's citybeat.com. And this one in particular has a whole bunch of different things on it. And so I was reading through each one, and I got to this one in particular, and I want to read this one to you, because this is kind of what spun me off in this entire process here. So this is the Beaver Creek State Park, which is up in northeast Ohio. And it says the park is special because of its history being a canal system in the 1800s, with locks that still remain in the park. One of them, called Jake's Lock, is said to be haunted by Jake, a canal worker who was struck by lightning while walking across the top. Many other legends exist within the park, including the tale of Esther Hale, known as the Bride of the Bridge. On the morning of her wedding, someone was sent to check on her groom to find that his house was empty and he was never seen again. Esther, grieving for months, wondering what happened to her soon-to-be husband, was found dead in her home. According to the book Haunted Ohio 2, it is said by the locals that you can still see her dressed in white looking for her bridegroom on the bridge over Beaver Creek in Columbiana County. She waits there every year on August 12th, a hideous figure, tattered in satin and lace, and if she touches you, you will become young and beautiful again, but you will die. This one struck me because of two major reasons. It's got a date, and it's got a name. And anytime something has a date and a name, my sensors go off. I'm automatically like, I can look at this. I can check this out and see what I can find on it. It makes it a lot easier to research. So I take the name Esther Hale, and I Google it. And in Googling it, I come across this page right here. So this is carnegie.lib.oh.us. So it's from the Carnegie Library in East Liverpool, Ohio. And this article goes a little bit more into detail on her. So it says, Esther Hale, the Bride at the Bridge, Sprucevale, Ohio, Beaver Creek State Park. There are, of course, several versions of this tale. Many blend the Esther with the legend of Gretchen's Lock because they took place within approximately a half a mile of each other. We'll get into Gretchen. Keep her in your thought. The tale of Esther Hale, also known as the Bride at the Bridge, took place in a small canal community known as Sprucevale. All that is left of this area is an old grist mill, Hamilton's Mill, an old building that remains of two locks and the Sandy Beaver Canal. When the community was alive and busy, Esther Hale was to be married. In the book Spooky Ohio 1995 and Haunted Ohio 2 1992, Chris Woodward describes the story. On the morning of August 12, 1837, Esther Hale hummed happily to herself as she put on her white dress and veil. It was her wedding day. The table in the parlor was decorated with flowers and vines. The cake in the kitchen covered with cheesecloth to keep off the flies. The wedding was set for 10 in the morning. By 10:30, the groom had not arrived, and the guests and parsons were beginning to fidget. At 12:30, they climbed into their wagons and drove away. The messenger Esther sent could find no trace of the groom. His cabin was deserted, said the man, and the ashes in the stove were cold. When Esther's friends tried to help her to bed, Esther shook her head, the tears running down her face. Finally, they left her alone in the dark by the window in the parlor. When they returned the next morning, the curtains were drawn, as if for a funeral, and they were never opened again in Esther Hale's lifetime. All summer, Esther moved like a ghost through the house. In the kitchen, beetles tunneled through the cake, the wedding flowers withered under the spider's veils in the parlor. Esther's friends coaxed her to eat and drink a little, and when they tried to get her to change her dress or remove the wedding decorations, she flew at them with claw-like fingers. They finally left her alone. Broken hearts kill slowly. 4 months later, a neighbor noticed that the door to Esther's house was open, banging back and forth in the December wind. He told the sheriff and the doctor, who took a party of men to the house. Snow had drifted throughout the house like a white shroud. Esther was slumped over the parlor windowsill, her veil over her face. Someone held up a lantern. The doctor threw back the shredded lace. Esther had been dead for several weeks. When they saw the horror beneath, they silently covered her over again. She was so buried, shrouded in her wedding dress. But the burial did not put an end to Esther Hale. It is said by locals that you can still see her dressed in white, looking for her bridegroom on the bridge over Beaver Creek in the Columbiana County. She waits there every year on August 12th, a hideous figure in tattered white satin and lace. If she touches you, she will become young and beautiful again, but you will die. Now, that's a lot of stuff to put in that story. They've got the actual date up here, August 12th, 1837. They've got her name. But there's a couple of weird anomalies here. One, her fiance's name is never listed. There's nothing that ever says, what happened to him, where did he go? he just disappeared. So that's the first weird one. Now, the second weird one is probably a little bit more of just me maybe reading too much into it. But down here where it says, all summer Esther moved like a ghost through the house. Now, if her wedding was supposed to be August 12th, 1837, that's kind of near the tail end of the summer there. So, basically a month and a half of the summer. And the rest of it would be fall and winter. So, again, that might be just being pedantic on my part, but it kind of stuck out to me. You notice here it mentions the book Haunted Ohio 2 by Chris Woodyard. And I just so happen to have a copy of Haunted Ohio 2. So I thought to myself, cool, I can read the source material. And the nice thing about Chris Woodyard is that typically she will put in references, if she has to, put in there's appendix in here, basically where the information came from, the references, that kind of stuff. However, this story, which is the story of Esther Hale, and it's found on page 9, and it's called Die for Love. And more or less, for the most part, a lot of it kind of keeps more or less the same wording. I think they probably took most of it word for word. So I found that kind of interesting. And it doesn't really, it basically reads as if it was a tale or a legend that was told to Chris, and maybe some locals nearby knew of the story, that kind of thing. And they have a story in here from someone named Nanette. It says, on August 8th, Nanette took a group of riders out on the trail. There's a horse trail around there. It was a clear night, but a mysterious fog rose from the creek up the horse's legs. As they passed Esther's house and rode onto the bridge, the last man in line said, I could feel a cold force pulling at my sweatshirt. Now, they said they could see nothing. It goes on like your typical, they get back and they find his shirt was torn. There's no houses there. There hasn't been houses there for a long time. Spruceville as a community, as a town, doesn't even exist anymore. It was a canal town in the 1800s in Ohio. So it did exist, but it's no longer a town. It hasn't really been a town since the late 1800s, really, is when it kind of died off, when the canal started to die. So that was interesting enough, and there's no references, so there's nothing that I can go back to and say, okay, this is where the story originated or where it came from. So I found that interesting, and so I thought to myself, okay, it's in this book that was published in 1992. Maybe I can find a reference from a website somewhere in the last 20, 30 years that would give me some kind of an indication of like where maybe the story originated outside of just the book. And so I went to the Wayback Machine, the Internet's archive. Love this place when it comes to looking for old websites. So the website that I was able to find, it's the same Carnegie website. I don't think they even No, there was nothing in here about it. But it's a Carnegie website, but it's a different area of the Carnegie website. And basically here they just briefly mention, and this is kind of the legends of the area, briefly kind of mention the Bride at the Bridge. But that is a link, and when you click that link, it brings you here. This is pretty similar word for word for from a lot of the book. Basically, they pulled it right from the book and put it on this webpage. And I think that's on purpose because it's a library website, so they're sharing an excerpt from the book about this story. And then the cool part is that I can inspect element, and I can actually look at down here where it was archived. So it was archived April 8th, 2000. And then it's got when I retrieved it. So it tells you when it was archived. So it's been almost 22 years since it was archived. So that's kind of interesting. So, and this was the earliest when I went to the Wayback Machine and just trying to find any reference at all. I checked Google. It's a little bit more difficult to search on the Wayback Machine, but going through Google, finding this 22-year-old website now where it was out there. But this is the earliest reference I could find online for the story. Now, that's not to say it wasn't other places in print before Haunted Ohio, but that's kind of the origin, if you will, for this story, as far as written record goes. One of the other things that I like to do when I'm researching a story is I will go in depth, especially when I have names and dates. And I will look at newspapers, and I will use sites like Ancestry to look at records, birth records, death records, census records, all of that stuff. So one of the places that I went to was newspapers.com. And going to newspapers.com, one of the cool things is because I've got the Ancestry membership with it, so I've got a lot of access to a lot of different newspapers on here. And so one of the things that I did was the first thing I did was search for Esther Hale. So I type her name in, I give it a broad range, 1830 to 1899, and go for it. Problem is, Esther Hale's a pretty popular name. So when searching, and notice my date range here is 1830 to 1899. And a lot of these papers seem to be from the late 1870s, 1880. But here's the problem, there's only 4 of them. So I'm thinking, okay, well that's kind of weird. And 1887, 1870, 1870, 1898. So got those on there. But nothing about Esther Hale before that. Now, that's not necessarily unique. Spruceville was a small town, so there would be not necessarily everything, you wouldn't necessarily get small town type of stuff. And if you search Spruceville, that's the other interesting thing. We'll get some things about it. There's different mentions to it. A lot of it's from the late 1800s. But, and then I can go back here in 1830 to, put 1850. And no results. So, no results for a newspaper mentioning Spruceville prior to 1850. But one thing that I did find was from December 9th, 1931. This is from the Times Recorder in Zanesville. And this actually mentions somebody, and I'll zoom in a little bit here, make it a little bit easier. But this mentions a Miss Emmeline Reynolds, which no relation in any way except that she was born in Spruceville in Columbia County, Ohio, October of 1839. Now, this would have been 2 years after Esther Hale supposedly had died and all this whole thing had happened. And it also mentions her father, Dr. Lloyd Reynolds. So my line of thinking is, okay, Dr. Lloyd Reynolds. He would have been the doctor in the area. You would think, and it mentions, I think, at one point in the story that the doctor is actually involved. He's the one that threw back the straighted lace. You would think that would have been something that would have been mentioned somehow. But even searching Dr. Reynolds, I can't find anything with Dr. Lloyd Reynolds. Now, I know he existed because, fairly confident he probably existed since he's listed as her father in the newspaper for her obituary. I found a couple of things that looked like they might have been a death certificate for him. Not gonna lie, I didn't go too deep down that rabbit hole because that goes in a whole different direction. But I started looking for death records. I went to Ancestry. I couldn't find anything at all on Esther Hale. And that's the one place that normally, if I'm searching, I'll find death records, at least, even for people born in the 1800s, where you'll have like a certificate of death or a census record. She would have presumably been on the 1830 census, but I couldn't find anything there. And that's usually pretty thorough, although they can be a lot more difficult because it's all digitized. So it's whatever the handwriting was like, plus the time worn of it. So it can be a lot harder to read and a lot harder to search through those kind of things. But I couldn't find any record at all of Esther Hale ever existing. So that brought me to thinking, okay, this is rather odd. There's this area, the story's been passed down, and I'm at a bit of a conundrum right now because essentially I have to wonder, was Esther Hale a real person? Was there a story that maybe got started somewhere? And in theory, there could have been a newspaper story that I haven't found yet. That maybe, because newspapers, especially in the 1800s, loved to put stories out there. And I'm not talking like local news. Obviously, they had local news. But for a lot of people who maybe couldn't get books, and kids especially that were learning to read, that kind of stuff, maybe people that wanted some entertainment, they would open up their newspaper and they would find a fictional story in there. And there's been plenty of times that I've been searching for something and have found a fictional story that was kind of fun and interesting to read, but ultimately was just a fictional story. And so I can't help but wonder, I can't find anything on this anywhere. Which is really interesting this seems like it would have been a pretty big, that's kind of a gruesome way to die, but to have no information anywhere. And that's the kind of stuff that, it takes me sometimes hours to research a single thing. I probably spent 5 or 6 hours just yesterday kind of digging into this and researching this, trying to learn more about it and see what I could find. And part of that led me to, I said to remember the legend of Gretchen's lock here. So I kind of went down that rabbit hole as well. Believe it or not, this one is also saved on the Carnegie Library website. So I kind of wanted to go through this one a little bit too, just because I found this story interesting as a legend. It's kind of fun to see where these things lead. So basically, this one is about Gretchen Gill, the daughter of Sandy and Beaver Canal engineer E.H. Gill. She's been the focus of a legend at lock. They don't have a lock number for many years, and I searched quite a bit around trying to find, there's no lock number ever referenced. I think it was either lost to time or just there was never really one given to the story. So basically it says, I'm including here several different versions of the story that persist even today. From the Sandy and Beaver Canal by William H. Vaudrey Jr. and R. Max Gard, 1952. So that was a book that was written in 1952 by these guys, compiling legends. So it says, one such legend is of E.H. Gill, canal engineer, and his daughter Gretchen. According to the legend, E.H. Gill, his wife, and daughter were traveling from Europe to the United States. His wife died on the way and was buried at sea. The grief-stricken father and his little daughter Gretchen completed their journey. At the time the lock above Spruceville was being built, Gretchen contracted malaria and died. A crypt was prepared in the masonry of the lock, and Gretchen was entombed there for a while. When Gill resigned during the Panic of 1837 and decided to return to Europe, Gretchen's casket was removed from the crypt in the lock and taken aboard the ship to be returned home for burial. On the trip, a storm at sea took the ship and all were lost. E.H. Gill and Gretchen joined their wife and mother in the waters of the Atlantic. This one also references Chris Woodward. It was written in very popular books called Haunted Ohio 1, 2, and 3 and Spooky Ohio. She's actually written like 5 or 6 Haunted Ohio books now. So this tells you it's an older article. In these books, she recounts the tales of ghosts and superstition from various areas around Ohio. Whilst these books are popular, they are also a good example of how legends change and become entwined with others. In Haunted Ohio, she states concerning Gretchen's ghost, a network of canals built in the early 1800s opened up the Ohio Territory to commerce and statehood. At Beaver Creek State Park in Columbiana County, there survives a part of the lock and canal system from 1836. One of the locks is named Gretchen's Lock. A charming tribute to a family member, one might think, but the place has a macabre history. Nobody seems to know which one is named Gretchen's Lock. I think it kind of varies depending on, and the one that I found that was kind of the most synonymous with the name Gretchen's Lock is no longer open to the public because it's kind of falling apart. It's rather old, decrepit, kind of falling. It's a mess. It's dangerous to go down there, so can't go there anymore. And I'm wondering if maybe over time, if there's another lock that people visit that becomes Gretchen's Lock. Time will tell. But she goes on to say, Gil Hans, the engineer who built the lock, brought his family from Holland. His young daughter Gretchen pined for the low country until weakened. She contracted malaria and died August 12, 1838. So a little bit different from the above time. If you notice up here, he resigned during the Panic of 1837 and decided to return to Europe, which means Gretchen would have had to have died before 1837. But this down here says she died on August 12, 1838. Again, another August date, which kind of, it seems weird that, Esther was supposed to be married on August 12, 1837, and this one, August 12, 1838. So I'm wondering if something happened around that time. She contracted malaria and died, raving about going home. Distraught, Hans had Gretchen's coffin temporarily entombed in a vault within the locked stonework until the family could return to Holland together. He made arrangements to sail. Gretchen's coffin was loaded onto the ship, and the entire family sailed into oblivion. The ship went down in an Atlantic storm with all hands. Yet even death could not take Gretchen home. On the anniversary of her death, the young Dutch girl can be seen walking along the lock that bears her name. So now we have two stories that both mention August 12th, one 1838, one 1837, which makes it really just insane that these two stories are tied so closely together. And it also kind of points to a flaw in the fact that if there was if this information could be validated as true, you would think that there would be something out there, something more than just these legends shared in the books. Don't get me wrong, I am a big fan of Haunted Ohio. I actually own 2 of the series. I had more, but I gave some of them away. But Haunted Ohio 1 and 2 I still own. And I'm a big fan of those books. We used to use them when I was a kid to learn. There's a lot of history, a lot of stories in here, very creepy stories. And we used to use them as kind of jumping off points for some of the things when our mom would take us out ghost hunting at some of the places. We actually visited a lot of the places in these books. So I'm a big fan of that. But I'm trying to... It makes it hard to research when there's no other information out there. There's no information, nothing about Gil Hans or his daughter Gretchen dying of malaria or anything outside of these legends. So there could be any number of reasons for why these legends would be passed down. They're interesting, for one, but they're kind of creepy and spooky, and they're sad. They're both extremely sad. You think about a father losing his child to malaria, losing his wife while at sea, like terrible, horrible things. And then for Esther Hale, like her fiance never showed up to the wedding, and I think that's a fear of a lot of, especially back in the 1800s, was a fear of a lot of brides of their fiance just up and disappearing and leaving them, fleeing off with somebody else, or something happening in the wedding not going through. There's the story that was actually passed around for a long time of the hide and seek bride, which actually looks like it was started probably around the 1800s, maybe earlier, but the earliest references I could find were the 1800s, where basically the bride on her wedding day, they decide after the wedding, during the party, to play hide and seek. Everybody goes and hides throughout the house. The bride hides in a trunk up in the attic, and she winds up getting locked in there. And then after the game's over, they can't find her anywhere. They assume she's run off, and everybody just kind of moves on with their lives. And then years later, they find her body in the trunk. Usually when like a younger girl, she's getting ready to get married, is looking around and opens up the trunk and finds the body of this bride. And so that's another one of the stories that kind of goes into like the fear of what might happen when you go to get married, if things don't go right. What happens if he doesn't show up? What happens if she disappears? Like, there's any number of possible things, fears that could be going through a young couple's minds when going to get married, and especially during that time, because any number of things could happen. So that's kind of my theory on where these stories came from, and I wanted to kind of give you guys a glimpse into some of the stuff that I research and how deep that I go with some of this stuff, because it's a lot of fun for me. I enjoy this part almost more than I enjoy the actual filming and putting the videos together, because the research is the part where I get to really dig in and really kind of dig up on some of these legends. And that's why I prefer to do older stuff, because it's a little bit more of a challenge. There's a lot of channels out there that do, true crime, modern mysteries type of thing, things that happened in the past like 30 years. And there's a ton of information. A lot of it's online. A lot of it's been done to death. Very, older things, because they're harder to research, tend to not be done as much, which is why I like to cover them, because for a lot of the time it's me discovering something that I hadn't heard or seen before, and I'm hoping that maybe others haven't heard, and it's a way to kind of keep the past alive. And while in the process of filming some of these videos, or of researching some of these videos, I found some really cool stuff sometimes. One thing that I found during the research of all of this, as I was kind of looking around, so this is the Google Maps of the area. So we got Spruceville down here, and this is kind of like the area that I was looking in where these two stories had been. And I look up here and I see Death of Pretty Boy Floyd. And I'm like, who's Pretty Boy Floyd? So I started looking him up. Turns out Pretty Boy Floyd was actually the nickname of a bank robber named Charles Arthur Floyd. And this guy, I might do a video on him as one of the Ohio Legend and Tales videos this spring or summer when the weather kind of warms up, because I would love to go out to the spot. Just because, so this is where he was actually shot and killed by deputies. And he's buried in Oklahoma. But dude was crazy. He was robbing banks, getting in gunfights, and this is back in the 1930s. Involved in a lot of stuff. But he was also involved in a gunfight, or supposedly involved in a gunfight with some marshals, where some marshals died, and he denied, went as far as to send a letter to the police saying, I wasn't involved in this. Pin me for all this other stuff, but I was not involved in this particular thing, and even denied it while he was being shot, just before he died. But this guy, he was known as a Robin Hood figure, because he would go, when he would rob banks, he would take the mortgage deeds that the banks had on people and burn them and get rid of them, so there was no record at all that these people had mortgages. For a lot of farmers in the 1930s in the United States, that was a big deal, because the Great Depression was going on. It was hardships and hard times for a lot of people. So he would do the stuff like that. He would take some of the spoils that he would get from the robberies and go and hand them out to general people, to farmers, and help people out. So he was kind of seeing stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, that kind of thing. But yeah, he got, in researching this story, that's the fun part about all this, is I'm researching a story that I found on a random website talking about legends. And I wind up with two possible, mostly probably historical, or I went up with two most likely fictitious stories that are just no more than legends. And I find out about a guy that was a pretty famous criminal that I'd never heard of before researching this. And this guy was like, he was wanted by J. Edgar Hoover himself, the founder of the FBI. Like, Hoover wanted this guy bad enough that he was making up things about saying that he was involved in things that he most definitely wasn't involved in, just to kind of raise public awareness and get his name out there, because he wanted this guy captured. And ultimately, he wound up getting shot and killed in 1934 in a shootout with police. It was really kind of a crazy story, and it's why I want to make a video about it. So I'm not going to go too in depth on it here. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff that I love doing. I love making those kind of videos, and I wanted to share the process and some of the stuff that I go through and some of the stuff that I find when I'm looking for this stuff with you guys. Just because it's going to be a couple of weeks at least before I get the revival of the Ohio Legends and Tales going. Partially because of my voice and being sick this week, and so I've been trying to take it a little bit easier. I wanted to do like 2 or 3 videos this week, and I feel so far behind. I know it's not a big deal, and I'm not really not far behind necessarily, but personally, I hold myself to, I want to accomplish something, and in accomplishing that, to me, accomplishing something is being consistent with getting videos out. And so when I get sick, I hit down myself, and I know that I don't need to be, but it's important to me. I want to get videos out on a consistent basis, which is why I'm making this video and sharing this stuff with you guys and letting you know what's coming up so that you know what to expect. Hopefully in the next week, I might be a little light again for the next week, just because I want to continue to recover, and a lot of it will depend on how I'm feeling and how my voice is doing. If this doesn't completely destroy it, recording this video, then I'd like to try and get another one out before next weekend, and maybe a couple next week. We'll see how things go. But that's all I've got for this one. I'll leave a video up here. Check that one out. And until next time, have a great day, and I will see you in the next one.